Right, Bismillah. So today we'll talk about how we go about naming oxyanions, or they're also called oxoanions. And these are anions, meaning these have their anions and they have oxygen. So anions means they have negative ions containing oxygens. An example would be things like this: CO3 2 minus, for example, or NO3 minus. How do we go about naming these guys? Right? So CO3 2 minus, this guy is named carbonate ion, and this guy here is named nitrate ion. And in this video we'll talk about how we go about naming these guys. Alright, so the first thing we have to do is memorize a bunch of these common oxoanions. So if you memorize these six, and really there's no other way of doing it, so the best way is just to memorize these six. So you should know what is nitrate and sulfate and chlorate and carbonate and phosphate and chromate. If you just memorize these six, your life will be extremely easy, right? So for example, you go and, well, what is this guy? SO4 2 minus, and if you've memorized it, you'll just say simply it is sulfate, right? And that is the way you go about doing it. Just memorize those six. And if you've memorized those six on the previous page, then you can essentially name any of the oxoanions that come your way besides those six, right? And there's a simple trick to that. So the trick is, right? So let's talk about this guy. ClO4, actually hold on, 6LO3 minus, right? So that's called chlorate. If you go back and you say, well, that's chlorate, and this is one of the six that you should have memorized. Okay, if you memorize this guy, right, and then somebody gives you, they say, well, what is ClO2 minus? Okay, and how do you name that? Well, the rule is easy. If you basically look at how many oxygens you have here. You have 3, and look at how many you have here. You have 2. So you have one less oxygen, right? So if you go one less oxygen, and the rule is that chlorate becomes ite. So you would say chlorite. So somebody says, you know what? How about this guy ClO4 minus? Now in this case, you're going one more. So again, you look at this guy, it's 8, and if you go one more, then you'd simply add the word per, right? And everything else is the same. So you say perchlorate. Okay. If somebody says, well, how about you go one less from here and you make it ClO minus? So you're looking at basically, you're looking at 3 oxygens here. You have 2 oxygen, and you have one less. You have basically 1 oxygen. If you have 1 less, here you add the word hypo, and then we use exactly what is here, which is chlorite. So you say hypochlorite, right? Alright, so again, same thing. What we're doing is you take the main ion that you've memorized, right? Of the 6 that I told you to memorize. So chlorate is one of those 6. Now the rule is simple. If you go look at the oxygen, if you go from 3 to 4, if you have one more, if you increase one more, you add the word per, and everything else the same. So you add perchlorate. If you go one less, then you change the 8 to ite, and if you have one less still, you add the word hypo and ite, right? So for example, if I say, well, what is NO2 negative? Well, first you look at what you've memorized. You memorize NO3 negative as nitrate. This is one of the 6 that I told you that you have to memorize. These are called the common ions. So if you memorize nitrate, Well, if you look at NO2 minus, it's got one less oxygen here. So the rule is, if you have one less oxygen, the 8 will becomes ite. So simply you write the word ite, and then you take this root nitrate and becomes nitrite, right? So NO2 minus is nitrite. Likewise, if you have SO3 2 negative, well, how do you name that? Well, okay, well, we know SO4 2 negative is sulfate. Well, I've got 4 oxygens here, and I've got 3 here, and so the rule is very simple. If you have one less oxygen, the 8 becomes ite. So you basically say sulfite. This is sulfite. Alright, just one last thing. Sometimes you have oxyanions that have hydrogens attached to them. So you have, for example, carbonate here, and somebody may say, well, what is this guy? HCO3 minus. Well, it's very simple again. We know CO3 2 minus. This is what you've memorized before. So right. So this is one of the ones that you've memorized, CO3 2 minus, and you know this is carbonate. Okay. If I say, well, what is HCO3 negative? Now please note that if you add an H plus to it, the 2 negative and the H plus will will balance each other to give you a net of -1. So you cannot say HCO3 2 minus. No. If you have an H plus, the charge goes down to -1. Right. So somebody says, how do you name this guy? HCO3 minus. Well, what you're doing, you're adding hydrogen. So you just simply say hydrogen. And then the parent ion was carbonate. So just simply say carbonate. This is called hydrogen carbonate. Right. Likewise, if you have 2 hydrogens, then you take out 2 from here. So it becomes -1 instead of -3. And you add the word dihydrogen phosphate.